21. Resilience by design. How emotionally aligned organizations endure. Resilience is often imagined as toughness, the ability to withstand shock, absorb impact, and bounce back quickly. But in global organizations, resilience is not defined by how hard the structure is. It is defined by how coherently it responds under stress. Resilience is not rigidity. Resilience is flexibility anchored by alignment. It is the capacity to adapt without fracturing, to absorb turbulence without losing identity, and to move through uncertainty without emotional collapse. Emotionally aligned organizations do not become resilient because they avoid disruption. They become resilient because disruption does not destabilize their meaning. When the world shifts, their emotional architecture holds. Their tone remains steady. Their interpretation remains shared. Their decision-making remains coherent. And because meaning remains intact, behavior remains aligned. One global financial institution learned this during a period of geopolitical instability. Markets were volatile. Regulations were shifting. Customers were anxious. In earlier years, such instability would have triggered internal fragmentation, different regions drawing different conclusions, escalating inconsistently, interpreting leadership tone through local fears. Yet this time, something different happened. The organization remained calm. Teams communicated predictably. Leadership tone traveled cleanly. Silence was not misread. Urgency was shared. People did not retreat into local instincts, they stayed connected to the collective emotional logic. The CEO later remarked, "It felt as if the organization absorbed the shock in one piece rather than in fragments." He understood then that resilience was not a strategy. It was an emotional condition. In contrast, organizations lacking emotional alignment often experience crises as emotional earthquakes. The disruption may be external, but the fractures appear internally. Regions begin telling different stories about what is happening, teams interpret leadership messages differently, escalation speeds vary wildly, and decision-making becomes inconsistent. The organization begins to wobble not because the crisis is unmanageable, but because its emotional foundation is uneven. One multinational retailer experienced this when supply chain issues rippled across continents. Without emotional coherence, each region interpreted the situation differently. Some assumed leadership was minimizing the severity. Others believed leadership had lost control. Others hesitated to escalate because they feared criticism. Leadership, unaware of the divergent emotional interpretations, attempted to correct the problem operationally. But operational solutions could not take hold because the emotional system was unstable. The crisis revealed a truth they had overlooked. Resilience had never been built into the emotional structure of the organization. Emotionally aligned organizations recover more quickly because their emotional infrastructure absorbs ambiguity rather than collapses under it. Ambiguity is shared rather than hoarded. Pressure is distributed rather than amplified. Biases are recognized rather than acted upon. Interpretation stabilizes rather than distorts. Emotional coherence becomes the shock absorber. This coherence also allows organizations to learn from disruption rather than merely survive it. When emotional architecture is strong, teams can reflect honestly on what happened. They can surface mistakes without fear. They can discuss missteps without blame. They can share insights without defensiveness. Without this emotional safety, organizations rarely learn, they react, protect, and repeat patterns. A senior leader at a global engineering firm reflected on this difference after a major incident. For the first time, he said, "We learned more from the crisis than we lost to it." What he meant was that the organization's emotional alignment allowed for honesty. And honesty allowed for growth. Resilience also emerges when teams trust the organization's emotional memory. When alignment is embedded, people remember previous stability. They recall how tone traveled in past crises, how leadership listened, how urgency was handled, how silence was interpreted. These memories form a psychological buffer. They tell teams, "We have been here before, and we remained coherent. We can remain coherent again." Without this emotional memory, every crisis feels like the first. Panic fills the vacuum. Past mistakes echo louder than past successes. Drift resurfaces. Emotional volatility increases. The organization becomes reactive rather than grounded. Resilience collapses because the emotional system has no internal continuity. The most resilient organizations also share a particular quality. They include emotional reflection within their strategic cycles. They do not solely review performance metrics after major events, they review emotional metrics. They ask how tone traveled, where interpretation drifted, how quickly teams synchronized during urgency, and where psychological safety held or faltered. These reflections are not soft conversations. They are structural maintenance. They allow the emotional architecture to evolve alongside strategy. One international healthcare organization institutionalized this practice after years of dealing with high-pressure environments. They introduced what they called post-shock emotional mapping, a structured reflection to examine how teams experienced leadership, collaboration, and meaning during moments of strain. Over time, the mapping became as important as their operational incident reviews. It revealed emotional patterns that technical analysis could never detect. And because of these insights, the organization became not only more compassionate, but more effective. Resilience also flows from distributed emotional leadership. In emotionally aligned organizations, the responsibility for coherence does not fall on one leader alone. It becomes a shared practice. Regional directors, middle managers, project leads all begin to internalize the emotional cues that stabilize the organization. They model steadiness. They contextualize tone. They give clarity during ambiguity. They prevent local drift before it grows. Emotional alignment becomes collective muscle memory. One global technology company discovered this after intentionally developing emotional literacy among its leadership tiers. When disruptions occurred, teams found reassurance not only in the CEO's message but in the calm, predictable behavior of leaders at every level. It felt like the whole organization exhaled at once, one employee said. That shared exhale, that collective settling, is one of the clearest signs of emotional resilience. Ultimately, resilient organizations are those whose emotional architecture can withstand uncertainty without disintegrating. They operate with psychological elasticity. They flex without breaking. They absorb without collapsing. They adapt without losing coherence. They maintain identity even when the conditions around them change. In global environments, where volatility is not episodic but constant, this kind of resilience is not optional. It is foundational. It determines whether an organization navigates uncertainty with strength or is defined by it. Whether it grows through disruption or fragments under it. Whether it inspires confidence in customers, regulators, and stakeholders or triggers concern. Resilience, at its core, is the byproduct of emotional alignment. In the next chapter, we move toward the culmination of the book, how organizations translate emotional alignment into long-term global reputation, leadership maturity, and the kind of sustained coherence that becomes unmistakable to anyone who interacts with them.